Fritz Eichenberg was born in 1901 into a Jewish family in Cologne, Germany. Following school, he worked as a printer's apprentice and studied at the city's School of Applied Arts and the Academy of Graphic Arts in Leipzig. In 1922, he published an edition of the German folk tale Till Eulenspiegel, and although nothing like as sophisticated as his later work, it was a series of appropriately comical medievalist wood engravings. A year later he moved to Berlin, and although it's known that he was working there with some success, I haven't managed to track down a single usable example of his work from this period. When Hitler's National Socialists came to power in 1933, Eichenberg wisely left Germany with his wife and children for the USA, where they settled in New York City. At this time he was primarily working as an artist, making wood engravings and etchings, many of which were visual reflections on his new home. But he also received regular commissions to produce political cartoons for the socialist magazine The Nation quite soon after his arrival. And unlike his other work to date, most of these illustrations were created using gestural ink lines and crayon shading. In 1937, Eichenberg published a highly distinctive wood-engraved edition of the Brer Rabbit stories from the Uncle Remus tales written by Joel Chandler Harris. They were printed in a deep red on off-white paper, and they were not only aesthetically pleasing, but had abundant anthropomorphic character, a combination which couldn't fail to be entertaining. Unfortunately, that was also the year in which his wife died unexpectedly, and naturally enough he was devastated by the loss. Although Jewish by birth, within a couple of years of this tragedy, he had become a practitioner of the Quaker faith, and remained so for the rest of his life. In 1939 he illustrated another anthropomorphic children's book, The Story of Padre Porco, the Gentlemanly Pig, written by Robert Davis. Unlike his Remus engravings, these illustrations were drawn entirely in pen and ink, and his exceptionally skillful control of this medium produced a series of highly entertaining and visually satisfying comical narrative monochromes. But in the same year he returned to wood engraving for the first of what would become a long series of illustrated literary classics, most of which explored the darker and considerably less frivolous side of human nature. This was an edition of Dostoevsky's nightmarish novel Crime and Punishment, published by George Macy's Heritage Press. And it was far from easy to reconcile these sombre and brutal illustrations with the same person who had brought Padre Porco and his friends to cheerful life. But however dark, both literally and metaphorically, these images were impossible to ignore, and gave a clear indication of how well Eichenberg could absorb the writer's narrative nuances and reimagine them in compelling visual form. For this book and many others he used a technique known as white line engraving, which, as the name suggests, inverted the usual method, and while the recessed areas retained the ink, it was the relief areas which appeared as white lines. In 1940 he worked again for the Heritage Press and turned his hand to Jonathan Swift's satire Gulliver's Travels, which was somewhat lighter in tone even if not in actual graphic execution, and he captured the frequently dark satire and grotesque fantasy narrative illustrated by so many others with a series of highly distinctive images. A year later he returned to Russian doom-laden classics for Turgenev's Fathers and Sons with the expected sombre engravings. But in 1942 he illustrated two considerably more light-hearted works. The humorous, musically themed book Fiddler's Folly and Encores, written by Robert Haven Schaufler, saw a return to his charming pen and ink flourishes. And he used a similar approach for the Middle Eastern tale Mischief in Fez, written by Eleanor Hoffman. Although these images, which were somewhat pointlessly printed in blue, featured additional textured shading effects created more than likely with crayon. But following this upbeat hiatus in 1943, Eichenberg published illustrated editions of two Emily Bronte novels, both, as you would expect, wood engraved. Bronte was well known for the sombre nature of her writing, and her novel Jane Eyre was possessed of more than its fair share of brooding menace, which was skillfully amplified by the stark, unsettling images Eichenberg created. and the other was Wuthering Heights, a book which was unfathomably lodged in the minds of some as a romance. And it provided him with even more opportunity to create yet more relentlessly intense illustration, with bleak moorland settings and a persistent thread of cruelty throughout the narrative. And seemingly not satisfied with having created this remarkably successful and acclaimed body of images, in 1944 Random House published his illustrated collection of the works of Edgar Allan Poe. And although this collection, naturally enough, contained the occasionally nightmarish elements of Poe's writing, it also had its fair share of humour, however sardonic. Many other illustrators before and since have been inspired to tackle the work of this particular writer, but Eichenberg's visualizations of the various narratives were consistently inventive and immersive, and certainly among the most enduring and memorable that have been created. In the same year, his edition of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina was published, but unusually in this book he created composite scenes, which were rendered with fine unembellished pen drawings to be displayed at the beginning of each of the book's 8 parts, rather than page illustrations of specific moments from the narrative. Why this approach was taken I have no idea, but it made for a diverting, decorative alternative to the usual format. He stayed with his lighter approach for 1945's illustrated junior library edition of Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, which featured some charming evocative full-colour ink and watercolour wash images. The following year saw the publication of 2 more children's books, both of which featured his more humorous side with considerable success. Miss Masham's Repose by R.H. White was an agreeably light-hearted children's fantasy, and Eichenberg's illustrations effortlessly brought the story to visual life for young readers, with a series of expressive and whimsical scenes from the story. The second book of 1946 was the even more absurdist tale The Runaway Tree by Henry Beston. And once more Eichenberg applied his imagination and mastery of pen and ink to create engagingly silly images of an anthropomorphic tree's central character and his interactions with humans. In 1950 he illustrated another junior library book, an edition of Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, which like the earlier Black Beauty contained a handful of highly decorative colour pages, as well as a large number of monochrome spot illustrations dotted within the text throughout the book. He stayed with children's work for the 1952 book Ape in a Cape, which featured a series of cheerfully surreal colour illustrations which were produced by Eichenberg as traditional stone lithographs, a process not widely used by most commercial illustrators or publishers at this time. Where all his other children's work had been in the form of illustrated novels, this was very much a modern picture book, with text kept to an absolute minimum. And although he was far from the first author and illustrator to indulge in this kind of absurdist wordplay and image creation, he certainly beat the much better known Dr. Seuss to the use of this creative device, as his Cat in the Hat didn't appear until some 5 years later. In the same year he published the book Art and Faith, for which he returned to wood engraving to create a collection of religiously themed images, and included some which specifically referred to the Quaker movement he still adhered to. Despite his own belief, Eichenberg was also associated with the Catholic faith through his friendship with Dorothy Day, and he contributed many religious illustrations to Day's newspaper, The Catholic Worker, for quite a few years. The Two Magicians, written by John Langstaff and published in 1953, was a frivolous fantasy tale about a series of magical transformations. For this book I'm fairly sure he returned to colour lithography, but equally these engaging images could have been created with ink, brush and crayon. Either way, they were yet another perfect example of the creative potential of words and pictures. Eichenberg's relentless productivity showed no signs of relaxing, and in 1954 his darkly comic edition of the medieval folk tale of Reynard the Fox was published. And where others had lightened and sanitised the tale for 20th century tastes, Eichenberg relished the red in tooth and claw aspects in the visceral wood engravings he produced. His expressive use of this medium made for a highly plausible medievalist collection. In 1955 he brought out a second frivolous collection of animal-themed colour images for Raccoon in the Moon, which was on similar lines to the earlier Ape in a Cape. It was created by Eichenberg again as limited colour lithographs and exploited his playfully surreal visual imagination with equal success. In the following year he created another volume of engraved monochromes for yet another gloomy Russian epic, this time The Idiot by Dostoevsky. The reputation he had now made for his visual affinity with such works of fiction was unassailable and with justification. Very few others had even attempted to tackle these complex and essentially downbeat epics on such a monumental scale and with such alacrity. In 1959, Eichenberg produced yet another series of expressive line-only illustrations for the book Heroes of the Kalevala, a Nordic saga from Finland, adapted by Babette Deutsch. And they were visually playful fantasy images which, despite the absence of colour, were remarkably vivid. It was the best part of another 7 years before he returned to children's bookwork, with Eagle Mask, a Native American story by James Houston in 1966, which used yet another graphic technique with a strong folk art flavour. And in 1968 he illustrated another by the same author, Akavek, an Eskimo Journey, and for this book he used a loose textured linear style to great effect. From the later 1960s into the 1980s he worked exclusively in wood engraving, and in 1972 he used his sardonic satirical abilities for a collection of limited edition prints in praise of folly, originally written by the monk Erasmus in 1549. And Eichenberg's frequently nightmarishly images and portrayals of the less desirable traits of humanity were every bit as salutary as the original text. In 1976 he published Endangered Species, subtitled Tales with a Twist, and as the title indicates, this was a revisiting of fables and folk tales which deliberately deviated from the original. He returned to his German origins for an edition of the medieval folk tale of Simplicissimus in 1979. This was another perfect vehicle for his white line engraving technique, and the compelling images he created showed clearly just how far he had come since that first foray into Till Eulenspiegel almost 60 years earlier. His 1980 collection of prints, The Dance of Death, took an unflinching and relentlessly pessimistic look at humanity and its general lack of that very characteristic. These images indicated a clear and some would say justified misanthropy on Eichenberg's part, but however depressing this collection may have been, there's no denying that it was a significant graphic indictment and a work of remarkable visual eloquence. He returned to more good-natured work in 1983 with the fairy story Poor Troll, which he wrote and illustrated in full colour with some highly attractive pen and what looks very much like coloured pencil textured colouring. As far as I can tell, this seems to have been his last overtly commercial illustration venture, but he did carry on working as an artist, and after a long and prolific career as a graphic artist and illustrator of both serious and comic writing, Fritz Eichenberg died at his home in Peacedale, Rhode Island in 1990 at the age of 89.